Alright, let's talk about quadratic equations. So this is a bit of a step up from the last video where we were looking at basic equations. Those are often called linear equations. The difference between linear equations and quadratic equations is that quadratic equations have your variable squared. So in this case we have x squared equals 4. Whenever we say something is squared, it just means multiplied by itself. So if I have 5 squared, that would be 5 times 5, and that would be 25. So quadratic equations are equations where you have an x squared, or whatever your variable is, it's squared. So here's a real basic one, and in this video we're going to be looking at pretty basic equations, and then in the next video we'll get to strategies for solving more complicated quadratic equations. But in this video you'll learn why quadratic equations are more difficult than the linear equations we looked at last time, and why they're a little bit more complicated to work with. In any case, let's solve this basic one pretty easily. Something squared equals 4. So this is like if I said I'm thinking of a number that when multiplied by itself makes 4. So let's use the basic rule of algebra to isolate x by taking the square root of both sides to get rid of this squared. That just gives me x on the left, and then the square root of 4 is 2. So the square root just tells you what number do you have to square to make this number. So the square root of 4, what number do you have to square to make 4? The answer is 2. So x equals 2 is the answer to our problem here. But there's a little hitch that we're kind of ignoring, and we can't afford to ignore it, which is that x equals negative 2 is also a solution to this same equation. So we actually have two solutions to this equation. In the last video we always only had one solution, but now we're getting two solutions. So why is that happening? Well, when you square a negative number, you always get a positive number, because a negative times a negative is a positive. And when you square a positive number, you get a positive number. So a number squared is always positive, and there are often, well, almost always, two numbers that you can square to make a positive number. So in this case, both 2 and negative 2 square to 4. So when you square either of them, you get the positive number 4. Let's do a few more examples to see how we handle this. X squared equals 9. I'm going to take the square root of both sides, but instead of just taking the square root, I'm going to put a plus or minus the square root in. So this maybe isn't the best way to see it, but plus or minus the square root of 9. Why am I doing that? Well, when you take the square root to cancel the squared, when a variable is being squared and you take the square root to cancel that, you need to recognize that it could either be the positive square root of 9 that is the answer, or it could be the negative square root of 9. And that's because both of those would square to make 9, because the sign, the negative sign would go away when you square it. So in any case, this cancels, and we get plain x on the left, plus or minus the square root of 9. Well, the square root of 9 is 3, so our answers are plus or minus 3. So one answer is with the plus, one answer is with the minus. Let's do a few more real quick examples. Plus or minus the square root of both sides. X equals, the square root of 36 is 6, so plus or minus 6. That's your answer. X squared equals 1. I'll take plus or minus the square root on both sides. X equals plus or minus 1. The square root of 1 is just 1, so both positive and negative 1 square to make 1. So not too complicated. The only trick is you need to be careful about that plus or minus. You always have to put it in there whenever you're taking a square root to get rid of the squared on a variable. Let's do some slightly more complicated examples. X squared plus 3 is 52. I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. So that's just the basic rule of algebra. It's like we did in the last video. Do it to both sides and it doesn't change the truth of the equation. So now we have x squared equals 49. And from here it's not so hard. We get plus or minus 7 when you take the square root of both sides. 6x squared plus 10 is 64. So a couple more steps to do here. 6x squared equals 54. I just subtract 10 from both sides. Now divide both sides by 6. I get 9. That's 54 divided by 6. And now plus or minus the square root. We get that x equals plus or minus 3. Okay, so you get used to this when you do it a few times. But often we're getting two solutions here. Let's look at an occasion when you actually get only one solution. So that there's only one time when you get one solution in a quadratic equation, and that's when you have something squared equals 0. If you go ahead and take the plus or minus square root of this equation, like we did the others, you get that x equals plus or minus the square root of 0. But the square root of 0 is just 0, and then positive 0 is the same as negative 0. So in this case, there's actually only one solution, which is x equals 0. And that's because there's no difference between plus 0 and negative 0. So you only get one solution. Here's another case where we'll only get one solution. I'll subtract 7 from both sides. And then we have something squared equals 0, and we know that that's just one solution, x equals 0. So you can either get two solutions or one solution, or in fact, you can actually have a quadratic equation that has no solutions. So that would be something like this, x squared equals -3. It's not possible. You can't possibly square a normal number and get a negative number. I just said that a few minutes ago. Whenever you square a number, you get a positive number. So if you try to take the plus or minus square root of this equation, you get plus or minus the square root of -3. But there is no square root of -3 because you can't square any number and get a negative number. So in this case, there's actually no solution. So you can have two solutions, one solution, or no solution, and those are all your options for quadratic equations. Let's look at another quick example. This is x squared minus 5 equals -5. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides. This actually gives me x squared equals 0, so now we only have one solution again. So you can have one solution, no solution, or two solutions. Most often in class, you get questions that have two solutions. At the end of this video, I'll give you a kind of interesting little aside about the difference between two solutions, one solution, and no solutions. Anyway, let's solve some slightly more complicated ones. Here's x minus 3 quantity squared. We still want to isolate the x, but now we have to take the square root first because it's everything in the parentheses that's getting squared. So now I have x minus 3 equals plus or minus 4. Now I'm going to add 3 to both sides. And just to make it look neat, I'm going to put this positive 3 on the left of our plus or minus. You could have plus or minus 4 plus 3, but I think it looks nicer to have x equals 3 plus or minus 4. So one solution would be 3 plus 4. That would be 7. The other solution is 3 minus 4, be -1. Let's do this one. X minus 5 quantity squared plus 10 is 10. I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides. And you might have noticed, here's another case where we have something squared equals 0. So when we take the square root, or the plus or minus square root, that is, we get x minus 5 equals 0. So x equals 5. So this is kind of an interesting case where we only have one solution, but that solution isn't 0. We did have something squared equal to 0, so that means we only get one solution, but that actual number that solves the equation is not 0. It doesn't have to be. In this case, it's 5, and that's the only solution to that quadratic equation. Here's a couple big boy quadratic equations which kind of throw everything at you. But the thing is, it's really just as easy as the simple ones. Every time you peel off one of these layers, it gets a little easier looking. So I'm subtracting 2 from both sides. Now I'll divide both sides by 4. Gives me 25. Take the square root, remembering my plus or minus. That gives me plus or minus 5. So our solutions are x equals -7 plus or minus 5. Alright, so again, one solution is with the plus, one solution is with the minus. So that would be -2 and -12. Here's our last example before that aside I mentioned a minute ago. 3 times x plus 1 squared plus 14 equals 6. Again, just take it one step at a time and remove the layers. You're trying to isolate x, so as long as you have that goal in mind, you should be fine. I'm subtracting 14 here. 6 minus 14, that would be -8. And now I'm going to divide both sides by 3, and you might kind of have noticed at this point something a little weird is going on. Not only, it doesn't really matter that -8 is not divisible by 3. The point is, now we're going to take the square root of both sides, but we have something squared equals a negative number. So you remember, you can't square a normal number and get a negative number, so even if we try to take the square root here, I get x plus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of -8/3. And that's just not possible. You can't have a normal number that squares to a negative number. So you could stop right here and say there's no solution. So that's, again, a case where there's no solutions. So you can have two solutions, one solution, or no solution. So let me, just for the last minute of the video, show you, keep you a little bit entertained so you're not getting too bored with all this abstract number stuff. I'll just tell you that whenever you're trying to calculate the intersection between a line and a circle, it turns out to be solving a quadratic equation. So this red line, if you solve that quadratic equation, you're going to get two solutions because that red line intersects the circle at 2 points. This yellow line is going to give you one solution because it only intersects the circle once. And this purple line doesn't intersect the circle at all, so you're going to get no solutions. So in some geometric applications, whether you have two solutions, one solution, or no solution can have some interesting implications. So that's basic quadratic equations. In the next videos, we'll look at more advanced ones and how to solve them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.